In Final Fantasy 15, you play as Prince Noctis Lucius Chaim, but he's not the real main character. Neither are the other main characters, Ignis, Gladio, Prompto, or even the final villain, Arden. No, the true main character of Square Enix's Final Fantasy 15 is you, the player, canonically. So, let's get into the weird disaster that was Final Fantasy 15. So, for people who have no idea what Final Fantasy is, I'll go through a small description. There's a story that every YouTuber who talks about Final Fantasy tells, and I've heard it so many times at this point that I'll just shorten it for you, okay? A long time ago, in the late 80s, there was a group of video game developers. And I know what you're thinking. Video game developers in the 80s? Damn, computers must have been riding on horses back then. Anyways, so this group of individuals was both small and extremely passionate. They'd made a few games, but none of them really sold well. They were just a group of devs with no money and barely any sales. They had one last chance to make a video game that sold well, or else they could kiss their dreams goodbye. That last game they made during that time is known as Final Fantasy, because it truly was their final chance of living their dreams, and also was in the fantasy genre. It was their, quote, Final Fantasy. And guess what? It sold extremely well, and now all of those people are extremely famous and very well respected in their fields. I mean, you probably knew that since the fact that I'm talking about Final Fantasy 15. You know the 15's in the title. I didn't have to explain all of that to you. Anyways, what about the games? I've gotta be honest, the Final Fantasy games are a lot more experimental than I was first expecting. There's so many games that just reuse old formulas that worked with their older games, and while yes, Final Fantasy does do this, they really changed it up from game to game. The base of old Final Fantasy games is just like the classic turn-waiting JRPG, sort of like Pokemon. However, this isn't even a steadfast rule for the mainline Final Fantasy games. They regularly switch up the type of gameplay. In Final Fantasy VIII, enemies level with you, so the higher level you are in game, the more things that the enemies can do to you. I don't remember which one, probably Final Fantasy II, but every action you could do had a level associated with it. Every time you defended, you would gain experience for that. Every time you took damage, every time you cast a certain spell, all of those separate things gained experience and could be leveled up. There's even a Final Fantasy where the main gameplay loop is hack and slash, but also every time you hit an enemy, you roll a slot machine. By the way, Zack Perry is the best Final Fantasy character, and if you disagree, you are objectively wrong.
Me? Gungaga.
Be angry in the comments, thanks. So, every Final Fantasy brings something new to the table. What's a defining trait of every Final Fantasy game then? Maybe that they're single-player games. Well, Final Fantasy 11 and 14 are both MMORPGs, which means they're like World of Warcraft and you play them online with a bunch of people. Fun fact, Final Fantasy 14 is one of the most popular MMORPGs in the world. From what I can tell on Twitter, which is obviously the most accurate source of information, the fans of Final Fantasy 14 are very passionate about that game, like to a scary degree. If I ever play it, I'll let you know how it is, but first, I gotta find some friends to play it with. Joecat, if you're watching this, so then, what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game? Well, here. It's whatever Square Enix tells you it is. So, what's Final Fantasy 15 even about?
What is it you're after?
World domination.
That's not even funny, man.
Every Final Fantasy game is needlessly complicated with extremely deep lore, and when you take a step back, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Did you know that Japanese pop star Gact is canon in Final Fantasy VII? Final Fantasy 15 follows the story of Prince and soon-to-be King Noctis. Spoilers. Noctis is the only son of King Regis, and has been tasked to go on a journey with his closest bros and get an arranged marriage. Yeah, it's kinda weird. The thing about Final Fantasy 15 though is it's an urban fantasy, which is a setting that is criminally underused in video games. Please make more video games like this, I'm begging you. What's urban fantasy for the uninitiated? So you know how traditional fantasy stuff is set in the Middle Ages, and you know how we also had the Middle Ages in the real world? Well, imagine a fantasy world, and now make it modern. So, we got like orcs walking around with phones, elves going to, file taxes. Kind of like that movie Bright with Will Smith, except it's, not directed by a terrible human being. So yeah, we got gods, kings, queens, and also capitalism. Back to Noct. His family's kingdom of Lucius has been at war with the Niflheim Empire for decades, and finally the two groups have decided to marry members of the royal family in order to broker peace. You know, classic fantasy stuff. So, Noctis is going to be marrying Princess Lunafreya, which thankfully for them, they're like already in love with each other. Like at the start of the game, we know that both Noctis and Lunafreya are in love with each other. So this like arranged wedding is like already icing on the cake. Also, every past king of Lucius has gone on some sort of coming of age ceremony with his closest bros and become king, and now it's Noctis' turn. Except at the end of the journey, he doesn't just become king, he also gets to marry the woman of his dreams. Man, things are looking great for Noctis. I hope they stay that way. So Noctis and his bros are going on a journey via car and like a bunch of highways that are infested with monsters to go meet up with his fiance and then get married. But let's get on to the bestest boys. Time for everybody's favorite segment, Husbando Corner. So we've got Strong Boy Gladiolus. He's big, strong, and also part of the Royal Guard. He's tough, loving, and most importantly, tough loving. Next is Ignis. He was Noctis' personal attendant ever since he was a young boy. He's the prim and proper British man who has all the household skills required to take care of a lazy prince. Wait, why does he have a British accent? They're from the same country, that doesn't- And finally, we have lovable soft boy, Prompto. Prompto is Noctis' friend from school. He was an orphan who befriended Noctis during their school years, and he's the same age as Noctis, which by the way is 20 years old. Prompto is like your high energy, picture loving, wisecracking kind of guy. The kind of guy who doesn't take things nearly as seriously as he should. He's basically a Lancer. Wait, he and Noctis went to the same school growing up. He was an orphan and Noctis was a prince. Do private schools not exist in Insomnia, or was Noctis? So we got this crew of boys who would literally die for each other, set to take a journey to help Noctis get married. Nothing could go wrong. To be serious for a moment, I think that the relationship between the four main characters is probably the best part of this game. It really does feel like taking a trip with four of your best buds who all have like a deep respect for each other, but with very different personalities and beliefs. I really like seeing platonic male relationships in media. It's not something that's often highlighted, and I gotta say, it's probably the best part of this game. This game is literally just a bro simulator, but with like fantasy world-ending BS in the background. So now that we got the inciting incident for the story, how is the actual story? It's a mess. First big thing to happen is King Regis dies off screen. It's so... why? Noctis literally reads a newspaper that details the destruction of his country and the death of his father, and that it was at the hands of the Empire that he's going to right now to get married. He reads it and he's like, oh no, my dad's dead, aw man. And that's how we learn about this massive international incident. This brings me to the first problem with this game. It's super clear that they want to do so many things with this game, but they literally just can't. So okay, something you have to understand about Final Fantasy games is that they take a very, very long time to make. It's no, GTA 6, but it's longer than most other games generally. Final Fantasy 15 came out in 2016, and it's almost 2022, and we have one trailer for Final Fantasy 16. What does this have to do with 15? Well, it also took extremely long to make, and especially compounded by the fact that after 13 was 14, and 14 was an MMORPG. So that means, for the most part, players had to go a while without a single player Final Fantasy game for a long time. If you don't play video games, something you have to understand is that gamers, trademark, hate waiting for things and are very entitled to video games and everything surrounding that. That in combination with shareholders, blah 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 business. Basically, the game had to come out before it was ready, and because of that, the shadows of what it was supposed to be are still in the game. Remember how I said you read a newspaper and that's how this giant revelation happens? Well, guess what? That whole incident happens over the course of the Final Fantasy 15 movie. Yeah, there's a movie, and it has extremely plot important details that you need for this game. If you played this game and didn't see that movie, well, too bad. Apparently some scenes of that movie have been patched in because it's literally imperative to the plot that you understand what's happening, and now we know that it was so important that it had to be patched in later. So this keeps happening in the game, by the way. And some of the side content that's needed for the plot has only been released recently. The last piece of content you need to view to understand what they're going for with this game came out in June 23rd, 2020. I want you to understand, it's not like this game had like small holes that these DLCs and side stuff were trying to like fill in little cracks. No, these are giant gaps in the story, and these just scratch the surface. The team behind Final Fantasy 15 wanted to keep making things for this game, but they just couldn't keep going. I think it was in some article that the higher-ups had to eventually pull the plug because it had been like 4 years after the game and they were still slowly releasing content to help fix this game. Eventually, they just had to cut them off, which culminated in the release of the Final Fantasy 15 book. And by the way, yeah, there is a Final Fantasy 15 book. It basically detailed what they had planned for the next few DLC releases. I read the book, by the way. I'll get into that maybe in a separate video if you're interested in that. It really does have some good and interesting stuff for this game. But you need to understand that this game is fundamentally broken because they had thought that they could fix it later, which results in a incomplete, quote-unquote, finished story that we have now, which just feels wrong. The pacing is off, entire story beats are missing, random characters show up, are given important roles in the story, and then just disappear immediately after. The worst part about this is that I can see a good story buried beneath all of this. I can see what they were going for, but it's so far away, and I know it's never gonna happen, but I can still see it, and that makes me feel pain. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the middle of the game, our protagonists find themselves trapped in the middle of enemy territory. The only way out is to have high-level clearance and access codes to the evil empire that they're fighting against. And what do you think happens? Noctis' childhood friend, Prompto, uses his clearance and gets them out, obviously. Everyone, including you, the player, are extremely confused. Why on earth does he have access to this high-level clearance? Noctis has known him since they were children, and he's been an open book. He's the fun, heart-on-his-sleeve guy. What's happening? And then the party asks him, what the heck was that? Why can you do that? And he tells them not to worry about it. And then it's dropped for the rest of the game. Literally, they don't ask any questions, and then you finish the game, and you learn nothing about why he was able to do that. Until 4 years later, when the DLC was released, we learned that he was a clone that has the same type of enemy soldier that you've been fighting against the whole game. These faceless soldiers and Prompto are one and the same. And then he goes on this whole journey to learn what his origins are, and also to understand himself. Also, did you know that once in the past he had met Princess Lunafreya and he kinda has a thing for her? Well, if you didn't watch the Final Fantasy 15 anime, you wouldn't know that. Yeah, there's an anime. For the most part, Prompto's been this fun-loving, selfie-taking, wisecracking kind of guy. He's the kind of friend who encourages you to do something dumb and probably against the law, and then films the whole thing. And now in this DLC, he's tackling who he really is. Is he a clone sent to destroy the Lucians? Is his friendship with Noctis fake? What does it mean to be a clone? Does he have free will? What's he fighting for? Is he destined to be evil? Does his life have meaning? Was anything ever real? What even is real? And finally, what do you do when your inferiority complex is aimed right at your best friend, who is also the chosen true king of this world as dictated by the gods? These are all things that he struggles with in the DLC. And if you played the base game when it came out, and that's your whole understanding of the story, well then you'll never get to see any of this. This DLC is honestly great. There's also DLC for each of the other main bros, because in the game there's this time skip that happens, and everybody comes back with drastically different personalities and brand new injuries, and they're just different. They probably had some sort of self-realizing arc, but you just didn't know what happened if you played the base game when it came out. Thankfully, those DLCs explore what happened during that time skip, but if you just played the base game, you're screwed. And this happens for so many things in this story. Things that are obviously meant to be expanded upon, and it's just up in the air whether or not you're gonna get satisfied in the future or not. So remember how Noctis was supposed to marry Lunafreya? Well, the first time we see her, after Insomnia Falls, she dies, almost immediately. Apparently she was supposed to have her own DLC, but that was cancelled. So then, what do we know about her from this game? Well, basically nothing. She's just this blank, cute princess archetype, and that's about it. Her existence in this game is literally only to die. She never gets a personality, she doesn't have any cool moments, she barely even talks. She does do some speaking, and you're like, oh yeah, finally, I get to meet this girl who Noctis is in love with. And she actually seems pretty cool and very competent, and she loves people. And then that's me just extrapolating from 5 lines of dialogue, but hey, I'm working with scraps here. And this happens so much, dude, I hate it. Who is Aranea? So, okay, Aranea is this female Empire soldier who shows up in the middle of the game and helps Noctis and his crew out, which is weird, because she's obviously one of the baddies, pun intended. She's this extremely competent female soldier who helps you out for some reason, and sometimes randomly if you're struggling in a battle, she'll actually show up and start helping you. Also, she's a dragoon, which is pretty cool, but you get the point. So many things happen in this game with zero payoff. But you know if you did get the payoff, it'd probably be great, like with the DLCs. RNA was supposed to get her own DLC too that explains her motivations and why she's helping out, basically her enemies. But guess what? It never happens. Why is she helping out Noctis and the crew? Is she attracted to Prompto? Why am I so attracted to her? We'll never know. TLDR, story bad. Well, what about the gameplay? It's alright, I guess. It can be fun if you turn your brain off. And a lot of things are just like weirdly RNG based. Like, remember how I said RNA will just show up and randomly help you? Well, your summons are also purely based on luck. A Final Fantasy summon is basically a summon where you just you can call out to the gods and they'll just come out and help you with their Omega attack in the middle of a battle. That's how they worked in other Final Fantasy games. You get to choose and use them tactically. But in Final Fantasy 15, they just randomly will help you out in the middle of battle. And this is because Noctis is the true chosen king, so he's tight with the gods. It'll be oh no, I'm fighting the final boss. Will a god come out and help me? Nah. But these 3 wolves, aw man, Rama can't let them live. They might hurt Noctis, so he literally scourges the earth clean. Cool. That's it about the combat, to be honest. What about exploration? This game has a lot of really beautiful and extremely detailed cities and forests, but they fall into the same problem with the story. You have this extremely large, extremely elaborate city, but then that's it? There's no hidden treasure, there's no side quests, you can't talk to anybody besides people who just sell you stuff or important for the story. It sucks, because you're seeing this extremely well thought out and very detailed city, and it's clear they wanted you to do things in here, but you can't. The lack of things just makes you kind of feel oh, this is empty, despite ironically how many people I see walking around in the streets. It's I'm just sightseeing until my main quest, essentially. So then what's the point of playing this game? I can talk about lore and gameplay all I want, but at the end of the day, why should you play this game? Here's the little secret. You shouldn't. I was watching a YouTuber talk about this game recently. I don't remember their name off the top of my head, so I'll have it somewhere on screen here. They were of the opinion that you, the audience, shouldn't spend money on Final Fantasy 15. It's not worth it. But also, they don't regret their time with Final Fantasy 15. And it clicked with me. I shared that exact same opinion. I didn't understand how to put it into words, but they were right. This isn't a game I recommend anyone to buy, but it's also not a game that I regretted my time with. Despite everything I've said and experienced with this game, it was still an enjoyable experience. This is a game where fundamentally everything about it sucks. The gameplay is alright, the story is terrible, the pacing is awful, everything is half-baked, the music is, well, it's a Final Fantasy game, so the music's actually very good. The beginning, middle, and end of this game suck. So why on earth can't I just say I hate it? Because I don't. I can talk about this game, its story, its developers, all I want. And by the way, speaking about developers, did you know they wanted this game to be a musical at one point? Only one game gets away with being a good musical game, and that's Kingdom Hearts 2 only in Atlantica. Anyways, the important point here that I haven't talked about the most important group of people when it comes to Final Fantasy 15. You, the player.
And Jill! Oh, I love you, man! And Jill!
Arden Lucius Kaim was the prince in line of being king of Lucius. However, all across the world, a dark plague had begun infecting random people and turning them into monsters. Doctors, natural scientists, magicians, every academic across the world was confused. There was no cure for this plague, except for one thing. Arden was the true king of Lucius, and had been blessed by the gods with the ability nobody else on the planet had. Arden was able to take the plague from people into himself, saving the people but slowly killing himself. His brother Somnus used this as fuel to usurp the throne for himself, stating that Arden had become a monster after taking the plague from so many people, and had his partner killed and then imprisoned Arden far away from anyone or anything. 2,000 years passed. Arden had somehow obtained immortality, possibly as a side effect of all the monster plague he was absorbing. Trapped and bound in an island that the world doesn't even know existed, Arden imagines images of his beloved Era as backstabbing brother Somnus. He imagines Era so that he will never forget her, every slight movement, every mannerism, so that he can never forget the woman he loved as she was. And his brother Somnus, their final meeting replayed over and over again, so that he can never forget the pain his brother caused him. Over and over, for 2,000 years, without a second of rest. By the way, the book actually goes into a lot more detail about, his suffering and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, if you want to hear about it, just let me know. Maybe I'll make a video, who knows. Anyways, so Arden eventually escapes so the plot of the game can happen, and he attacks the capital city of Lucius, Insomnia. And honestly, Insomnia has a really sick defense system where basically the souls of ancient kings are housed in giant statues of them across the city in case of emergencies, and they can like activate just basically like giant mechs essentially and defend the city from invasion. So Arden defeats the current king of Insomnia and forces him to call forth the spirit of his brother, the greatest king in all of history, known as the Founder King to modern people, King Somnus Lucius Caem. Arden has one question for his brother. Why? Why any of it? Why did he kill his beloved Era? Why did he steal the throne and betray him? And man, I've never seen someone be so disrespected before. This all happens in the Arden DLC of the game, where you play as Arden, and I want you to put yourself in his shoes for a second. You've suffered for 2,000 long years alone with your thoughts, every second wondering why your brother betrayed you. You spend your whole life in servitude to the gods and to the people, only to have your whole world destroyed. You spent every second in pure agony, wondering, God, why? Oh, why did this happen to me? And then finally, after defeating the giant statue that houses your brother's soul, you ask him why. And he says, quote, this is a direct quote from the video game,
I dare not ask your forgiveness. I do ask your understanding.
What? You took everything from me. Everything. And you ask my understanding?
I pray your soul find repose, brother.
That was the most PR BS I've ever heard. That was a non-answer. He didn't say anything. In fact, his non-answer speaks volumes. Somnus was a king who ruled over a kingdom and became a legend. He now watches over his kingdom from beyond the grave. He's lived his life, and what happened with Arden was just part of his legacy. It was a small part of his life, and he spent more time as a king than not as a king. For him, it was insignificant, but for Arden, it was everything. Arden has spent literally thousands of years waiting for this moment where he confronts his brother, and the only thing he gets is a smug non-answer. Why did his brother betray him? Just because. You'd think this would be the worst part of the story, but it's not. Arden, after being unsatisfied with his revenge, just decides whatever. If Somnus is gonna be like that, I'll just destroy the kingdom, starting off by killing his descendant and current king, King Regis. He's about to kill King Regis when all of a sudden he's teleported. In front of him is the god of blades, Bahamut, seen as the most divine of all gods. Bahamut tells him can't kill King Regis because it's, quote, not his time yet. With a literal god in front of him, Arden asks the obvious question. Tell me, if you met literally God, what would be the first question you ask? I feel like most people would ask the obvious question of why? What is my purpose? And Arden asks this exact question. He asked Bahamut why. Why was he chosen for his powers? Why was his beloved killed? Why did Somnus betray him? Why did he suffer for so long? What did he suffer for? Why is he alive? For what is the meaning of his life? And oh my goodness. Bahamut tells him that his purpose is to spread evil across the world, so that one day the chosen king, Noctis Lucius Caem, shall slay him and bring end to his darkness. His purpose is to be the bad guy that loses. Noctis's purpose is to be the good guy that wins. Everyone else in this world is purely set dressing that exists either to die or praise Noctis for when he wins. This is a game. This is literally a video game where the people, the world, the very lives of every character are crafted exactly for you, like every piece of media. The only difference is that Final Fantasy 15 is more honest about it. You wanna know why Arden suffered so much? Why he lost everything and continues to suffer despite his best, trying to defy fate? It's so that you can have a cool boss fight against him where you go Super Saiyan and then defeat him. That's why. Why is anyone suffering? It's so that you can feel like a hero after you've saved everyone, obviously. Final Fantasy 15 is just a complex puppet show that was designed as a way to satiate your enjoyment for a few hours. Arden is just a puppet. Once he learns this, he tells Bahamut that he disagrees, and that he will defy fate, that in the end he will be victorious, and show that in fact he does have free will. You wanna know a secret? No matter how many times you play Final Fantasy 15, Arden loses in the end. Arden will never win. He's trapped in an endless cycle of suffering every time you boot up the game, and he knows it. Also, to add insult to injury, this whole Bahamut scene, Bahamut summons Arden's dead girlfriend and then has her stab him a whole bunch of times, just to, you know, add extra salt into his wounds. So, one last question. If everything in this game sucks, nothing really matters, what's the point of any of it?
No way. He just ate my hair.
Have you ever had a friend who had the thought, the universe is gonna explode one day, so nothing really matters? I hate this train of thought, because essentially what you've done is had half a thought. You need to finish that thought. It's like saying 2 + 2 equals. Equals what? I won't get into too deep philosophy, because I like my viewers, but essentially what you're doing is you're talking about existentialism. The idea that because of A, B, or C, nothing really matters. But there's this second part to existentialism that everybody just conveniently forgets or just doesn't know. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but essentially Jean-Paul Sartre says that if nothing matters, then we create our own meaning. If nothing matters, then you should be happy, not sad, because that means we create our own meaning in things. You get to decide what your life means for yourself. What makes you happy? How do you want to live your life? If nothing truly matters, then you get to answer these questions for yourself. You get to live unbound from any third party, because in the end, the only person whose opinions matter is your own. If the universe is going to explode one day and what you do doesn't matter, then do whatever you want. Live how you want to live. Love whoever you want to love. Be who you want to be, because you're the one who decides what your life means, because in the end, ultimately, you're the one who values your life the most, because you're the only person who can give your life meaning. You're the only person who can truly derive any meaning from your life. So, have fun. And that's how I see the mediocre video game Final Fantasy 15. Not as a story of 2 puppet men trapped in a cycle of suffering, but as a game where Noctis gets to chill and hang out with his buds and do the right thing, not because it's his destiny, but because he wants to do it. Final Fantasy 15 is a game where you can literally feel the passion of every human being who worked on it. It seeps through every poorly designed level and awkward cutscene. You can see glimpses of the amount of pure love that they had for this project. From the game to the pieces released on the side, to things like the movie, the DLC, the book, the anime. I think the reason that people can't bring themselves to hate this project is because you can see the pure love and passion for it that's still continuing even to this day. Their love cut short due to things like business and, releasing games in less than 10 years. I'll be honest and say, I think this could have been one of the best or worst games if you gave the game, another 10 or 20 years. This was someone's magnum opus, their One Piece, and I'm just sad they weren't able to do it justice. My ultimate dream for this game would be for a Final Fantasy VII remake sort of redo, but for Final Fantasy 15. But this is why I believe that Final Fantasy 15 is the best, worst, good, bad game. It's a game that has so much potential and then delivers on 5% of that potential. But you can still see it, you can still feel it, but you can't do anything with what isn't. And so you have to derive meaning from what is there. And what's there is alright. The final scene of Final Fantasy 15 is Noctis on his throne. He's in formal clothing with his wife to his side. Both Noctis and Lunafreya are dead, and before they're gonna pass on, Noctis is showing her a picture from his adventures. Throughout the game, Prompto would take pictures during random moments. It was a cool feature where you got to see yourself fighting a giant turtle the size of a mountain or saving a city. But before the last events of the game, you get to choose one picture from all the many that were taken during the course of the game. And this picture is the one that embodies your adventure. And before he passes on, this is the picture that he shows to Lunafreya. This is the picture that embodies the adventure for you and for Noctis. The image I chose is one of Noctis and the dudes just hanging out. And I'll be honest, I started to cry as Noctis showed it to Lunafreya. Yeah, I'm a crier. This is the moment that exemplifies the theme of the game. The moment where you get to choose what meaning you derive. Whether you chose a picture of Noctis and the guys or a picture of a giant mountain turtle, either way, in the end, you get to choose what the game meant to you. This is the essence of Final Fantasy 15. Hi, if you like what I had to say, please consider subscribing. Maybe, I don't know, like and comment on the video while you're down there? I mean, you might as well. Also, let me know what you thought of the new format. All of this YouTube stuff is extremely new to me, so I can only know how things are if you tell me how they are. I hope you enjoyed experiencing this experience with me. Anyways, thank you for watching.